You got many small farms now. You've got more farms now in New Hampshire than you used to have because there's many small ones and they're going to develop their vegetables, find different ways to market them. And there is no one here that can tell you what farming is going to be like in 25 years because of the technical changes, the seed you have today. We can grow corn now that the leaves at the end are so tight they almost never get worms in them. They're hybrids, but most of the vegetables you eat are from hybrids. And I think that as time evolves and people grow more and more of the vegetables and buy more and more of the vegetables locally, there'll be changes that we can't foresee at this time. And I just have to say that there's been talk about families and what that means for families working together and knowing that they all work together to make farms successful. That is still true today. I know in my lifetime that my family has been very helpful in at times, especially when I was needed extra help. If I needed extra help and the boys were off to college, I called them up and they came home for the weekend. And they never told me what they gave up for the weekend, but they came home and I appreciated that very much. I think I'll leave it at that. I wanted to kind of go over from the beginning of time, just to see that the evolution was very slow for a long time, and now it's going to change faster.
Working? I'll just take the other questions. Thank you, Doug. Now it's working? Is it?
Yeah,
Yep.
that's working.
Okay. What you said about family is really true. And so to speak a little bit, I'm going to tell a little bit about my farm, which has an illustrious history, not so much connected with our family, but my family, before they walk out the door back there,
They support you, Lorraine.
I just wanted to introduce, we have 4 generations of our family living at Stuart Farm today. My parents, Jim and Lorraine Stuart, are here in the audience tonight. You want to just say hello? Nate is our son, who's part of the Heritage Commission, and his wife Judy, who was late. Judy and John, my husband, have been down in the barn tonight with the veterinarian and a heifer with some calving problems, and so this is how it is with farming. And so, Judy, I'm glad you were able to come. And their 2 daughters, Hannah and Samantha, are continuing the farming tradition with Hannah and Sammy's magical eggs, which you may be able to find if you're lucky on the Vine in Exeter. And they're taking a step back from that modern new technology, much more efficient chickens, and they're raising these heritage breeds that don't lay quite as many eggs, but they come in beautiful colors, and they get a whole lot more than 60 cents a dozen. Our farm is now known as the Stuart Farm on Route 108, along the Squamscott River. You can see it from the bridge when you cross the Squamscott River. Set back off the road, and I find a lot of people don't realize that we have cows up there, which is probably a good thing. Because one of the people who called into the exchange show this morning identified herself as living in Stratham, and that she was interested in the show because she had moved here in 1996. And she told how when she moved here, she was pretty close to a dairy farm, and there was also an orchard, and there was a reindeer farm, and things have changed, and all of those farms are no longer functioning. But she said that it wasn't so bad to not smell the dairy farm anymore.
I heard that.
You heard it too. That's one of the challenges of farming in a community that has evolved and developed and has a whole lot more neighbors who may not be used to the rural life. But our farm and the history, it is eligible, has been determined to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, as their statement of significance says, the Stuart Farm is an important local example of the evolution of a large and productive coastal New Hampshire farm, reflecting the accomplishments of a number of significant owners. From its roots as a mixed family farm, the farm has continued to redefine itself to meet changing agricultural trends, first as a dairy farm, later as a poultry farm, and again a dairy farm. Today it is one of only 2 surviving dairy farms in the town of Stratham. This was written a few years ago also. But the point is that this farm was found to be eligible for the National Register in part because it has evolved and changed and survived as a business. And that's really an important point that I think Doug and all of our panelists have spoken to this evening. There have been artifacts found of Native American agriculture happening in our fields, and even more so in some of the neighboring lands along the Squamscott River. So farming's been going on here a really long time. And then it was a part, of course, you know, all things Stratham begin with the Wiggin family. And it was in the Wiggin family, Simon Wiggin and a whole series of Simon Wiggins, really. And then I think our farm is great because it kind of busts a few of the myths about farming. You know, first of all, that all farms in the old days were small. This was a large farm, and this was typical here on the coast. You hear about the Frank Jones farm in Portsmouth from people who worked there. That was a huge operation. So, and that it's always been changing. We always think of farms being handed down to sons, and this farm stayed in the extended Wiggin family for a very long time, but the names changed because there were handing down to daughters, which has continued in our family's tenure at this farm. So it had, let's see, back in the 1870 census showed 131 working farms in the town of Stratham. And what is now Stuart Farm was at that time one of the 5 largest in terms of the value of production. In that era, there was a record broken for potato production on that land. The farm passed from the Wiggin name into first the Clark family and then the Robinson, but again, this was by marriage, so it was still in the family until 1875, when it was sold from Abednego Robinson, who had built the house that my parents live in today, which is the largest house and the only one found to be of continuing significant historical importance because it has not been modified as much. It's not the oldest house. The oldest house on the farm is from the early 1700s, but has been more modified. The Robinsons sold it to Benjamin Whitcomb, who becomes one of several what we call colorful characters to own this farm. He was the Boston Fire Commissioner, reportedly, and quite the racehorse breeder. Had a racehorse named Wildfire that was said to be one of the greatest studs nationally. And there are a number of stories have been told. Then it went to his son, Charles Whitcomb, who also maintained the horse breeding at the farm. And there were, significant number of horses kept at this place. It was called the Riverside Stock Farm, I understand from some of the records. We also had learned from a great-granddaughter who showed up one day of the Whitcombs. She showed up in a late-modeled Volvo. My husband was coming in with a truck or a tractor or something and saw this car parked at my parents' house. Knew that my parents were not home, and so he stopped to see if she was looking for someone, if he could help her. And she said that her grandmother had been born in that house, and that she had come to see the farm. She had Delaware plates on her car. She and her husband were both racehorse veterinarians in Delaware. And she confirmed many of the stories we'd heard about Mr. Whitcomb's drinking. This is, the stories I'd heard from Bill Baker, who's a successor, illustrious owner of the farm, that the silver maple alley of our driveway, which is like 3/10 of a mile long, and it's all lined by these maple trees, that those were planted by Mr. Whitcomb's to guide his horse home at night when he was returning from his drinking expeditions in Newmarket. I remember even when we first moved to Stratham back in the 1960s, we would have these old guys that would show up. They would say, I worked at this place when the Bakers owned it or when the Christies owned it. We had people these old guys who said they worked there when the Whitcombs owned it. And they told about hauling these huge wagon loads of liquor bottles out to the woods. And I always thought that they must be exaggerating. But it seems, this is even a member of the family confirming this. But also, one of Mr. Whitcomb's good drinking buddies happened to be the famous American Impressionist Child Hassam. And that is how, the Courier Gallery owns a watercolor, which was displayed recently in an exhibit in the last year, that was painted from the field right behind my parents' house, a view of Newmarket, Newfields across the river. And this great-granddaughter said that she had been stopped at the Museum of Modern Art in New York on her way up, where she saw some others that he had done at our farm. So, I believe he stayed in a cabin on Squamscott Road. That's the story.
Well, my house, Benjamin Whitcomb owned that, and all
Yes.
of ours.
Yes.
There was 5 barns across the street, which all had these racehorses.
Yes, exactly. And of course, our farms were connected back prior, also back to the Simon Wiggin days. So the Whitcombs then sold out to Edwin Baker. And the story was that Edwin Baker was an executive with a weather stripping company in Boston, but he'd grown up in Greensboro, northern Vermont, and had a dairy farm up there, family's dairy farm, and really wanted to have a farm again. And he was pals with Walter Longshot, somebody in Dover, who was into the horse racing thing, who told him about this Whitcomb farm had run into hard times financially, and it was being foreclosed, and that he might be able to acquire this farm. And this story having been told to me by Bill Baker, Edwin Baker's son. And so the Bakers acquired it in 1919 and owned it until 1944. And during this period, it was a really famous Holstein herd, registered Holstein herd. The Bakers purchased the cattle to start their herd in Vermont and also in Canada. The ones bought in Canada were brought in at Rockingham Junction. One story that Bill Baker told us was how when they were unloading a load of heifers that had come from Rockingham Junction at the train depot, one heifer was awfully excited when she got off that truck, and she took off and ran all the way across the fields and jumped into the river. And they were sure that she would immediately come back out of the river, but no. She swam across to the other side, and they had to actually rescue her from Newfields. The Bakers kept 200 head of cattle on that farm back in that era, the 20s, 30s, 40s. That was a big farm back then. They had a milk processing plant, sold bottled milk into Exeter and Epping and the surrounding area. There was a dormitory over the processing plant for the workers, the milkers. I mean, there were so many people working. There are 4 houses on our farm. We like to say modern zoning would never allow Stuart Farm to be built. I mean, it just would never be allowed. And it makes altogether too much sense, you know, for modern zoning. At one time it had a common steam heat system. It has a common well water system, so it's like a small municipal water supply. And the 4 houses are clustered very close together. It's, you know, it's good smart growth design. The buildings were dramatically altered over time. There had been beautiful, huge horse barns of the Whitcomb era, which the Bakers converted to dairy. And then when the Baker farm had to be dispersed, which Edwin Baker had died, and Bill Baker and his wife were managing the farm, but they really had to sell the farm to settle the estate. And so it was sold at auction in 1944. The whole herd sold. These cattle, the top selling bull sold for $5,000 in 1944. Serious money. And the top selling cow, I believe, was like $3,500, also pretty amazing. And they went on to go into herds that went on to continue to be famous breeding herds in the United States. And then it was bought by Andrew and Carolyn Christie of Kingston, New Hampshire. And Andy Christie was also a very illustrious leader in poultry genetics. We had in New Hampshire 2, well, Doug is right, poultry was king in this state through that period. There were many, many chicken farms. I think John Dodge of Dodge's Agway likes to tell how many poultry, Nathan, more poultry in Rockingham County than...
There's more poultry per square mile in Rockingham County than any county in the country in the 1940s and 50s.
And the Christies and the Hubbards over in Walpole were 2 very famous poultry breeders, chicken genetics being developed. And the Hubbards, you know, any of you who are maybe UNH alumni or anything like that, you'll know that name because they are the most generous donors, philanthropists of the University of New Hampshire. They came out in the end on the winning end of the genetics competition and sold out their business to, you know, it's now owned by a big multinational company, but it's still in business. The Christies were more stayed in the dual purpose New Hampshire red kind of breeding, and it didn't last as well when things changed and poultry moved south. The whole industry, you know, we had just a collapse in the poultry industry here in New Hampshire and throughout the Northeast, and most of the chickens moved to the south. And that was when my family was able to buy the farm in 1961. And but the Christies had taken those big barns, and 2 of the 3 barns had been converted to poultry into 3-story poultry buildings with grain elevators, dramatically changed the architecture and structure. We, of course, came back and turned it back to dairy, and eventually tore down the 2 great big ones. And at this point, we have completely changed the farm buildings. We have one small little piece of brick building that had been a horse and carriage building. That's where our generator is housed, but that's about all. That's the only original farm building that's left on the farm. So, indeed, agriculture continues to change and evolve, and we can't know what it will be like. That's why it's so important when we do these agricultural conservation easements that they be written with flexibility so that farm businesses can continue to flourish and evolve in the future, and yet protect